Hello. Okay, it's working.
All right. Well, good evening, and thank you for your patience as we work through a little technical glitch with some gremlins in the system. And welcome back to the Library of All Saints Cathedral for our Thursday night series looking at the Passion narratives in the four Gospels. This evening, joining Bishop Miller is Father Michael Cover, who is a professor of New Testament at Marquette University and also a priest of the Episcopal Church and now licensed to work in the Diocese of Milwaukee. So thank you for joining us this evening. So since you've been patient enough to work through all the glitches, without further ado, Bishop Miller and Father Cover.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Father Cover. Thank you for being with me tonight. We're delighted that you're here in the diocese, and the Diocese of Dallas is letting you serve here in Milwaukee, so that's a good thing, and we're grateful that you're on the faculty at Marquette. Tonight, friends, we're talking about Matthew's Passion narrative. We talked about Mark last week, and we thought it would be good, Dr. Cover and I, begin just briefly to talk about the concept that, according to many scholars, Mark is the original source and, or certainly at least one of the earliest extant Passion narratives that is known to us today, and that that one of the things we want to pay attention to now is how the way the other two synoptic authors, both Matthew and Luke, build on what Matthew said and what specific things they highlight and call for us to look at. Would you agree, Michael? And would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Sure, Bishop. So Matthew, as I think Woody mentioned last week, some people put Mark at the end of 60, maybe right around 70. And with Matthew and Luke, we're dealing with a couple different things. One thing is that Matthew is actually taking us back to a new historical source that's also potentially as old as Mark, and that's Q, the Quelle in German. So with Matthew, we're not necessarily only moving forward, we're also moving closer in a way to the Jesus of history. But Matthew is also later than Mark. And so as we watch the themes develop in Matthew, we'll want to think about how is Matthew updating Mark? Is he unhappy with Mark? Is he happy with Mark but wants to bring Mark's message forward to a new audience in a certain way?
Right, and how is he making sense of things that happened after Mark's gospel was written to this community, which probably most people say, if you'll remember our Bible study from Matthew a few years ago, I want to do that Matthew was written for Christian Jews, that these were Christian people who in many ways had a Jewish heritage and identity.
Sure, and I think it's the kind of one of the going theories is that Matthew was written in Antioch, which is a city that Paul, of course, had visited and worked in. And so one of the things that Matthew is doing is actually kind of trying to mediate, if you will, between maybe the Peter and James parties on the one hand and the Pauline parties. All of these sort of streams of early Christianity are flowing into Matthew's gospel. Of course, it's also post-70, so the temple has been destroyed, and so that's a new piece of the horizon. And there are continuing conflicts in Antioch between Christians and Jews. So as we think about the way the Jews are portrayed in Matthew's gospel, one of the things to keep in mind is that there may be historical things going on, but there's also this ongoing story of the church in Antioch, which is kind of being told. One other thing I say about Mark, one of my professors at Notre Dame, John Meyer, calls Mark stark, dark, laconic Mark, because there are all these gaps in the narrative. There are these places where we'd like to know more and Mark doesn't tell us more. And so I think one of the things that Matthew for us, helping us see beyond those dark spaces and kind of illuminating them. For me, talking on Matthew tonight is something I'm really looking forward to and to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Before we dig into the specific scenes, I think it's important to also look at some parallels in Matthew between the birth narrative and the Passion narratives. Raymond Brown, who's been one of the principal sources that I've used in my preparation for this, you of course are aware his first major work was called The Birth of the Messiah, and then that inspired him to then do his second major work, The Death of the Messiah. And Brown notes in the book that we've both been looking at, A Crucified Christ, in Holy Week, the book that we've commended to all of you who are studying with us, the parallels between the birth narrative and the Passion narrative. He notes that only in the birth narrative and in the crucifixion story is Jesus referred to as the King of the Jews. The Magi come and look for him who is the King of the Jews, and then Jesus is called and asked, "Are you the King of the Jews?" and called the King of the Jews in the Passion narrative. The other parallel is in both the birth narrative and in the Passion narrative. There's a pattern of fivefold pattern of scenes alternating between those friendly to Jesus and those hostile to Jesus. So you have Matthew and Mary and Joseph and the Magi, and then you have Herod and those who are out to get Jesus. In the Passion narratives as well, there's the disciples are.
When I think of the Gospel of Matthew, I think of Matthew, our sacred space, and the whole thing has this beautiful symmetry. You have infant hand and offset by the Passion narrative. I think one thing that Matthew is doing to maybe improve the structure of Mark. He said, you've got this Passion narrative, but it's sort of like you've only got one column and you need a second one. And so there are all kinds of correspondences. And then, of course, the heart, which Brown didn't touch on as much, of Matthew is this sort of fivefold discourse by Jesus. You have 5 discourses elegantly arranged, each picking up on the other. And so the architecture of Matthew is phenomenal. And just to pick up on this, the issue of the maybe King of the Jews, if I could.
Mm-hmm. Sure, please do.
It's not only that Jesus is only called King of the Jews in the infancy narrative and the Passion narrative, but particularly you have a group of Gentiles calling him King of the Jews in the Passion narrative, and then you have a group of Gentiles calling him King of the Jews in the Passion itself. And so it's the soldiers mocking. Whereas the Magi are coming to adore him as King of the Jews, you have the soldiers mocking him as King of the Jews. And I think we're to sort of taste the bitter irony of that. Matthew is a very, very sad gospel in a way. We usually associate the infancy narratives with Christmas and happy and creches and mangers. Of course, that's all from Luke.
Yes.
If you read the contours of the Matthean infancy narrative, it's very dark.
Yes.
Being
led off to Egypt and
right.
and children getting killed and
that's right.
Joseph and Mary escaping with the Christ child and all those things. That's true. And it's also, I think, important to note that in that intersection, those 5 well-written discourses that you describe, any scholar corresponds to the 5 books of the Pentateuch.
Sure.
And so there's there's something about that 5. Well, let's dig in then to the scenes of the Passion narrative. You will remember that there is provided for you, if you're turning in for the first time, let me tell you, there is an outline of the Passion narratives. And the Passion narrative, according to Brown, can be divided into 4 acts. Some acts have more than one scene, as acts in a play will. But there's the Gethsemane and the betrayal in Act 1, the trial before the Jewish authorities in Act 2, the trial before Pilate in Act 3, then the actual crucifixion and burial in Act 4. So we're going to look first at scene 1 and look at what happens in Gethsemane. Matthew's Passion begins, of course, with Peter's denial being foretold, and then they go out to the Mount of Olives. And one of the things that struck me as I looked at it this week was the sense that the Mount of Olives and the King of the Jews is the same place that David goes to weep and to mourn during the revolt of his son Absalom, who tried to overthrow him. And David, of course, was betrayed by one of his inner circle as well.
That's right, Ahithophel.
Right, yes.
Right, and Brown points to this. I was struck by that because this is actually another place where I think Matthew cues us up for this in the infancy narrative. In the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, he begins with a sort of threefold genealogy, 3 sets of 14 generations. And many scholars think that number 14 is important because according to the numerical significance of the letters in David's name add up to 14. And so in other words, Matthew begins the Gospel by saying threefold David, David, David. And then as we get to the Passion narrative, where does Jesus go but to the place where David wept? And throughout the Passion narrative, I think we'll see increased number of psalms being referenced, particularly psalms that David sings. So the Davidic shape, I think, is absolutely there.
Right, I would. And then the other thing that stood out for me as we looked at this section is that the prayer that Jesus says in the garden, Brown and others think may reference the Lord's Prayer. or at least allude to that because of what he prays, let this cup pass me, let me not be going to the time of trial, and each of those.
And thy will be done.
Thy will be done, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Another place where as in Mark's gospel, there's the 3 times that the disciples are sleeping. But one of the things that Matthew also makes a little bit clearer is who had the sword. Last week, if you'll remember, we were saying, well, somebody had a sword and somebody hit somebody, but nobody knew where. But Matthew wants us to know that it was one of Jesus's followers who had the sword. Then Matthew also wants us to, excuse me, I'm having a challenge with my note there for a second. But Matthew also is looking at some kind of assurance in that passage, and I've lost the note that I made, so I apologize.
Oh, that's fine. One of the things, I'll do a little teaching moment. Bishop and I are both looking here at what's called a synopsis. So if you've never had a chance to look at a gospel synopsis, what it does is essentially lays out the 4 gospels scene by scene, column by column. And so what we're doing in part is following along and looking at ways that Matthew, Luke, and John are modulating, but are changing things perhaps from the other versions.
Indeed. Okay. Well, let's then look briefly at the betrayal of Judas. In many ways, it's except for naming that it was one of the disciples, Jesus's response in that is also
quite interesting.
Quite interesting.
It is, yeah.
To put your sword back into its place. All who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scripture be fulfilled, which must say it happens in this way? That's, I think, the piece of assurance that I was looking at. And then there is the address.
And what does that sort of show you about Jesus' character in Matthew over and against maybe what we get in Mark?
Well, the first thing that stood out for me, of course, was the angel image reminded me of some of the Psalms that
That's right.
certainly alludes to Psalm, he who gives
91.
in charge over you, which of course is the one that's mentioned in the temptation.
Yeah.
And so that's the first piece that stood out. And certainly the picture that Matthew paints is of Jesus of clearly much more understood what exactly was going on. There's not as much of a secret, less of a mystery in that passage.
Well, in other words, here's a kind of Jesus as Adam again. You mentioned the temptation, so let's just take that a little bit. Jesus is in a garden,
right?
And he's being offered a similar temptation to what he encountered at the beginning. But he's in some sense overcoming that temptation.
Right.
So there's I like that. That's very nice.
Interesting. Good. Yeah.
So, well, with this, what interested me about this is as you follow along, I'm really interested in the way Judas figures in this whole cycle, and because Judas's role in Matthew is going to come to a little bit more of a head than it does in Mark. But as I'm following along in my synopsis, I noticed that after Judas betrays Jesus, Jesus has a little response, something that's not said previously. So it says, and he came to Jesus at once and said, "Hail, Master," and kissed him. And then Jesus says something to him. And Mark, he doesn't say anything. He just simply lets it move along. But he says, Jesus said to him, "Friend, why are you here?" Now, this might seem like an innocuous statement, but I thought maybe what I should do is look and see where else does Jesus call somebody friend. And it turns out there are only 2 other times in the Gospel of Matthew. And this is something else about Matthew's theological artistry that I think is important. Matthew is the great cross-referencer. And so many times he'll say something and we're intended to then search through the rest of the gospel and find out what it means. So the other 2 times that Matthew uses the word friend are both in parables. And they're always in parables speaking to someone who has misunderstood him. So in the first case, it comes in the parable of the workers of the vineyard. You'll remember they're the workers who've been working the entire time, the entire day, and then some other workers come at noon and some other workers come later on. And at the end of the day, the workers that were there in the beginning start to grumble. And they say, well, we didn't get paid as much as everybody. There's that payment, Judas. We didn't get paid as much. And what Jesus says is, friend, have I done anything wrong to you? It's that word hetire. Now, the second time, it's even worse for Judas, though. The second time happens in the parable of the wedding banquet. And you will remember that parable. Jesus, the king is having a wedding banquet, and so he sends people out, and they gather everyone to come in. But there's one man who doesn't have a wedding garment.
Mm.
And Jesus and the king says to him, "Friend, how did you get in?" And so I think what's happening here is Matthew is cross-referencing us to the parables, and suddenly Jesus is actually stepping into the parable and showing us what happens when ultimately judgment comes, when we find ourselves no longer in the story world of the parable, but in the real world, face to face with the king, and unaware that we've misunderstood something fundamental about the story that we're in. So it's a moment of judgment, and I think Judas forces us to think in Lent about ultimately our judgment, when the parable is no longer a parable, but our story. Right.
Certainly, yes, and of course we'll talk next week about how Luke responds to all this. But the sense of friend, I'm so struck by that, and the sense of and of course we could go down a rabbit hole about that parable and how wedding garments were supplied in the first century and all of that.
Sure.
But so yes,
I guess it's important to say that it's not the same word, philos, the one that says, "When I've called you no longer slave, friend." It's not that word. It's tyros. So it's maybe more literally companion. So it's just in other words, there are two kinds of friendship in the Gospels. There's maybe the true friendship, philos, and then there's the false friendship, the tyros.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, anything else that we want to say about the trial? Or shall we then move into the trial before Jesus, before the council, and being led off to Caiaphas?
Let's do that.
Okay, so we're now moving in, of course, into later on in chapter 26, verses 57 through 75. Jesus is arrested, taken to Caiaphas, the high priest. Peter, of course, is following him at a distance. That's similar to the other gospel writers. And then we hear the council of the chief priests and the council with false testimony against Jesus, but they found none. Well, many false witnesses came forward, and they make a similar witness that was made. This man will destroy the temple in 3 days. And then the high priest says, "Have you no answer?" But Jesus was silent. So in this case, Jesus is silent. There's I'm trying to contrast that where when they ask Jesus so then the high priest says to him, "Are you the son of the Messiah?" And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, for now you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest tears his clothes, and they say that he deserves death, and he's invited to prophesy, but not just to prophesy in general, but to prophesy who struck him. And then we have, of course, Peter's denial. And that's one case I found where there really isn't much difference between Matthew and Mark's telling of the story.
Sure, I think that's right. There are some minor differences here and there. Single cock crow versus double cock crow. There is, in Matthew, Peter moves from a simple no to an oath. Mark doesn't have an oath, but Peter has an oath in Matthew, and then to cursing himself if he's not telling the truth. One thing that struck me was that Matthew adds the detail, he wept bitterly. Mark says he simply wept, and Matthew says he wept bitterly. And I do think that that is actually a kind of sign of the mournfulness. We don't like necessarily to hear sad stories, but the mournfulness of this, I think, is highlighted in multiple ways. So, yes. But you're right that for the most part, most of the details are quite similar here.
Right, indeed. And then, of course, so we move on from that scene, and we move on to Jesus as being delivered to Pilate, and they simply talk about they've handed Pilate over to the governor. And then comes that section which is just simply found in Matthew, the death of Judas.
Right.
And that's such a rich section, because it really calls to mind so many Old Testament images.
It does. You want to?
You lead them out.
Sure. Well,
you lead off.
There was the the initial one that you already mentioned was David and Ahithophel, who was his counselor and who betrayed him in the Absalom story. And that was an interesting one, particularly because the way that Judas and Absalom die are reminiscent of each other as well. And I think this shows us not that Judas wasn't a historical character, or that we should think of the Passion narratives as some kind of midrash on the Old Testament, but just that Matthew, as a theological artist, wants us to think about Jesus as David, and those who have betrayed him as similar to those who were unfaithful to David, which means essentially what you have is a fight between two groups of Jews. And I think as we think about maybe the way Jews are portrayed in the first gospel, that's an important thing to keep in mind. That the early Christians were composed of Jews, and Matthew is written for potentially a largely Jewish Christian group, and that this is in some sense an inner Jewish struggle. Right, who is the Messiah?
We're really witnessing at least one side of a family fight, if nothing else.
That's right. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yes. Of course, the other piece of the other place where it just screams out Old Testament fulfillment is in the 30 pieces of silver, which is a reference, of course, both to Jeremiah and Zechariah prophecy about the price of him who betrayed him at 30 pieces of silver. And so
those are kind of mysterious references there. Of course, the text says it's Jeremiah, but then the quotation is Zechariah. And so there are some parallels perhaps with Jeremiah 18 and 19, but it seems like, again, that this is supposed to help with the notion that Jesus' story is fulfilling the scriptures of Israel, particularly the scriptures of the prophets in this case. So I think with the connection to Zechariah, Jesus is being likened not only to a king, as in the figure of David, but also to a prophet. And we're seeing the kind of prophetic rejection of Jesus, perhaps, in these, again, cross references to.
Well, true, right? Yes, because I think underneath that too, we would want to acknowledge that in the trial before the Jewish authorities, we're dealing with the Sanhedrin, who were very much of the Sadducean school, most likely, and yet there's also this kind of trial under the prophetic tradition, the Pharisaic tradition as well, although they're not mentioned so much in the Passion narrative.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that this Judas story adds, Luke, of course, also tells the Judas story, but he doesn't tell it until Acts. And Matthew doesn't have the advantage of having Acts of the Apostles to write, and so he kind of combines his narratives of Jesus and the early church and writes, as it were, his Acts of the Apostles right across the top of his gospel. And so if you like, you can kind of read Matthew as a palimpsest, kind of written twice over with the sort of historical narrative of Jesus and also the story of the church. And I think that what is happening here is a kind of meditation. In Mark, you get Peter and Peter's denial. Here you get Judas as well, and Judas's denial. And so as Christians, I think we're being asked, where have our denials of Jesus fit into this story? And there's a darker side in Matthew. There's the ability that we could say our denials, when Jesus says, why are you here? Do we have a good answer to that question? Why are we here? Was it to betray him? Did we have good intentions? And who do we find ourselves identifying with? I think Matthew has enriched that and maybe upped the stakes in terms of our ability to answer that question, why are you here?
I think that's very true. We're rapidly moving through the time, and we haven't gotten very far. So let's move on then to the trial before Pilate. And certainly, in the trial before Pilate, one of the questions is always, is this choice that Pilate gives the Jews, is that even a historical thing? And there's a lot of commentary in the scholarship about that. Let's assume that it wasn't historical. What in your opinion is, not that it was or wasn't, but we're just going to follow it down that line. What in your opinion might be the reason for Matthew wanting us to hear about this choice that people make? Does it go back to the Peter Judas thing? Is there something more going on there? And
well, let me say two things. First of all, historians challenge the trial before the Sanhedrin.
Yes.
Quite a bit more than they challenged the trial before Pilate. So just to clarify, and I understand you're not saying that,
right,
but just to clarify, the trial before Pilate is historically very certain. The question is whether there actually was such a Roman custom.
Right, exactly.
Kind of,
right.
Giving it to. I think this may actually play into this this notion of there being kind of two ways to be a disciple, Peter or Judas, two ways to be a revolutionary, Jesus or Barabbas. And this is highlighted in some manuscripts of the New Testament by Matthew revealing that Barabbas' first name is actually Jesus. And so in other words, you have two Jesuses, both on trial, both purportedly revolutionary. Which is the Jesus we're supposed to follow, and what does it mean that when set in the group of witnesses and when set on the jury, humanity chose Jesus Barabbas and not Jesus the Christ? I think again, it's a similar position. It's a similar kind of the gospel writer asking us to put ourselves into the story and say,
is it earthly power or spiritual power?
Who do we
is
identify
it right?
with?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have, and only in Matthew's gospel is there the dream, and Matthew, of course, is big on dreams all the time.
That's right.
We see a lot of those in the birth narrative as well. People are warned by a dream to go home by another way, and Joseph is warned by a dream to take Jesus and take him to Egypt. And here we have Pilate's wife telling Pilate to have nothing to do with this innocent man because he has suffered about him greatly because of a dream. And that's something that only Matthew records.
Sure. And I think one of the interesting things about that is it does place, again, a positive Gentile figure on the side of Jesus, as opposed to a positive Jewish figure, Joseph, who's receiving the dreams. I think it's interesting to think about the balances. You have a Gentile, a male Jew, and a female Gentile, both in some sense images of what it might mean to be an apostle or to be a disciple of Jesus in the church. So as we're sort of thinking about the church level of this narrative again,
yes, right.
I think we're seeing a picture of the openness of the gospel to anyone, to a Jew like Joseph, to a Gentile like Pilate's wife.
Precisely. The other thing that is unique and has always stood out for me, and also causes a lot of consternation, is when Pilate asking them. Well, let's just read. We're at chapter 27, verse 22. Pilate said to them, "What should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" After they request Barabbas of him. And all of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself." And the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Powerful words. Every time I hear them, I'm reminded of Bach's setting of the St. Matthew Passion. But those words have also, in some ways, been a real challenge for the church in later centuries.
They have.
And, go ahead.
Oh, no.
And so, I mean, one of the things that really struck me as I read this, it had to do with in responsibility for blood and death. In Judaism, there was the sense of his blood be on his own hands, his blood be on us. And so, for example, when Joshua and the invaders and go into Jericho, they say to Rahab the prostitute, "If your family stays in your house, they're fine. If anything happens to them, their blood is on us. And but if they come out, then their blood's on their own head." And the whole sense of blood being on us in terms of the innocency in the sacrificial rites of the temple as well.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's all there. So there are maybe three things to say. First is that this is one of the places where we see sometimes charges from outside that the Gospels are anti-Semitic. And the fourth Gospel also comes up against this charge. And I think it's important for us as Christians to have a response to that, to be able to think about a way to show that Christianity at its heart is not impugning the Jews, particularly today, and after the Shoah, I think we have to be particularly responsible to that. So a couple thoughts on how I hear that. The first is that in Jewish law, and I'm thinking here of Mishnah Sanhedrin 4:5, there is it's a stipulations for those who will be witnesses in a capital case. And what the Mishnah does is it says anyone who's going to try to put someone to death, to be a witness in a death case, has to be willing to say that guiltless blood is upon not only the false witness or the witness who is responsible for an unjust death, but upon all of their children. And it's rooted in a very close exegesis of the Cain and Abel story. In the Hebrew text, when God says, the blood of your brother is crying out from the ground, the Hebrew actually says the bloods of your brother. And so what the rabbis interpret this to mean is it's not just the blood of Abel, but it's the blood of all of Abel's offspring. And so when they say, his blood be on us and our children, what they're doing is they're taking responsibility. They're saying, we know that this is a capital case. We're going to take responsibility for it. And so in that sense, it's simply reflective of the Jewish world that they're inhabiting.
And the legal law, right, yes.
Yeah, and so I think Matthew has inserted a level of realism, similarly with the two witnesses. He specifies two witnesses. So there's a sense of realism about the character of the way that the trial goes on in Matthew. But the second point, and Brown is I think very good on this, says that the place perhaps to seek an amelioration of this, in other words, to say that it's not a sign of God's anger at the Jews or something like that, is in the notion in the sort of institution narrative where Jesus said, "This is my blood poured out." So if we hear that, his blood be on us and our children, as a kind of echo of the institution narrative, this is my blood poured out, there's actually a kind of opening to the Jews in a way similar to Paul in Romans 9 through 11, where he longs for the salvation of his Jewish brothers.
Yes.
Those are two ways I think you could respond, either that it's sort of Matthew creating verisimilitude, and that it also has a potential sort of opening to Jews to believe from the context of Matthew's community. And that's the third point. In Matthew's own, in the context of the post-70 Matthean church in Antioch, we know that those Christians are having struggles with Jews. And so some of the anti-Jewish language potentially is not, I would say, anti-Semitic, but anti-Jewish in the context of that early community. And so I think remembering that community was dealing with specific things that we're maybe not dealing with now is a way to understand that language.
Very much so. And along with that, I think we can also see that devotionally in two ways. His blood be on us in the sense that image of being washed in the blood of the Lamb and being cleansed, and the devotion in some parts of the Catholic tradition to the precious blood of Jesus. So there's certainly that strain on it, but there's also the admission of our own guilt, in the words of that him who was the guilty, who brought this upon thee. I'll ask my treason, Jesus has undone thee. So I wonder if the Matthean community also experienced both of those things with that as well.
And particularly if we're thinking about Jewish Christians, I've always sort of read that line, "His blood be on us and our children," kind of autobiographically. I think I naturally let that be my voice. Not the voice of some other that I'm angry with, but my own voice, my own desire to have that blood upon me. And so I think, again, we're dealing with multiple ways of reading a text. There's an important answer to these questions.
Thank you. Well, let's move on then to the crucifixion, proper, because I think it's important in each of the Passion narratives to look particularly at what Jesus says from the cross and what others are saying as Jesus is crucified. So I'm at pericope 249, section 249, Matthew 27:33 to 44.
Okay, I'm there.
So when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. He tasted, he would not drink it, and there they crucified him. They divided his garments, his clothes among them by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head they put the charge, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right hand, one on his left. Those who passed by to him, shaking their heads, saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also and the scribes mocked him He saved himself. He cannot save others. If he is the King of Israel, they don't use the word Messiah. They let him now come down from the cross. He trusts in God. Let him deliver him if he wants to, for he said, I am God's son. Again, an echo of Psalm 22. He trusted in the Lord, let him deliver him. So again, we have some psalmish language. And then we come to Jesus's actual death. And it's very similar to the Markan story, but it's interesting to note that after Jesus cries again with a loud voice and breathes his last, not only does Matthew record the temple being torn in two from top to bottom, but the earth shakes, rocks are split, tombs are open, and many bodies of the saints would fall asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and into the holy city and appeared to many. Yes. A fascinating image of at that moment of the death of God's Son and the sacrifice being completed, this great shaking of all that is going on, of all whole created order.
That's right, and I think Brown has a nice note here on the way that, just as in the infancy narratives, the natural world responds to the birth of Jesus with a star. So in the Passion narrative, the natural world responds with an earthquake. And so there's a sense that the same kind of revelation, these are the same kind of events of the same kind of importance, such that the world itself kind of goes into convulsions when this happens. There's also, of course, echoes of Ezekiel 37 here, with the famous valley of dry bones. And then God said to me, mortal, these bones are the house of Israel. And he says, thus says the Lord, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from the graves, O my people, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from the graves, O my people, Israel. And I think for me, it's interesting that it's actually the earthquake in Matthew which converts the centurion. Not just the fact that Jesus has died, but it says when he saw the earthquake. Right, and so the earthquake is what catalyzes this conversion again of the Gentiles, just like the star brought the Gentiles to Jesus in his infancy. So the earthquake brings the centurion. And Matthew does another thing here. He says it wasn't just the centurion, it was the group around him. So it's a kind of communal conversion at this great sign, a sign intended initially for Israel, but now opened to the Gentiles at the cross.
Just as the star was a sign to the Gentiles as well.
That's right.
Fascinating. I missed that one, so I thank you and for sharing that. And then we come, of course, to the burial of Jesus. And we hear about the Joseph of Arimathea, who's a disciple. He went and asked for the body. The body's given. It notes that the tomb in which Josephus laid it in was his own tomb. That's right. And I'm reminded of that great John Ireland hymn, and mine the tomb in which he lay. And from my song is love unknown. That's right. And so that sense of what Jesus does is for us. Yes. And the tomb that he enters and the dead places that he cleans out is for us. And I think we can't hear the Passion narrative without hearing. And to know that's actually something Matthew wanted to give us. Yes. He said, I'm going to add his tomb. Whether that's a historical detail or not, I think shows us that the gospel writers are kind of worth paying attention to in their own right, because they have these gems that are there that you can see by just noticing he added a word. Yes, that's right. Very rich. And then, of course, the placing of the guard, which Brown is quick to say really begins the resurrection narrative. And if you wanted to hear more about that, I would invite you to look at my sermon from last Easter Day when we talked about that and is available on the website of the Diocese of Milwaukee. We have about a few minutes left. Do we have questions from folks in the audience or out in cyberspace? You can tweet your questions to me at Bishop of MK at Bishop of MKE. That's capital MKE, abbreviation for Milwaukee, or folks in. Do you tweet? Occasionally. Okay. Usually when ahead of me. I'm ahead of you. Well, there you go. I'm feeling pretty hip here all of a sudden. All right. Questions from folks that are here tonight, things that you're wondering about, things you wish we had said or wondered about. Christopher.
I'll just ask a question which some folks might wonder about. I wonder about it too. So you bump in occasionally to things and you say, like so he says Jeremiah, but it's actually Zechariah, or he corrects Mark or gives a different fact or something. And so how can we understand those discrepancies? And do we sort of want to say, the gospel writer made a mistake, or how do you all think about that?
Well, I think my first response is this guy's writing from memory, and he's thinking it's Jeremiah when it's actually Zechariah, and just how human people like you and me will sometimes quote somebody and you think it's from Shakespeare's The Tempest, but it's actually from As You Like It, or you hear a song and you think it's by one performer, but it's actually by another performer. And so my sense was because Matthew probably didn't have we think of having a Bible you can pick up and look at and have a reference. He's going by what he remembers of the telling of the story, and probably didn't have time to walk down to the local synagogue and pick up one of the scrolls and go back and look at it. So he's remembering it, and that doesn't take away the fact that it is in Scripture.
I think in that particular case, there may also be a reference to Jeremiah. So in other words, there's just a lot of fireworks kind of going off. And I think sometimes we maybe make the mistake of reading the Bible or ancient texts as though they're going to be this kind of one-for-one correspondence. And so there's a kind of really rich biblical intertextuality that's going on in that passage. And I think a key to that is it says, so that it would be fulfilled what was said in the prophets, in the plural, actually. Mm-hmm. So it may be that there's kind of a key that there are several prophetic texts, particularly the Potter's Field may be referencing Jeremiah in that case. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah.
Would it be fair to say that in the Greek world, in the Jewish world at that time, actually that it didn't really matter because they weren't writing in a lineal kind of way that we would expect a story to be told in our day and age, that it starts in the beginning, it ends, and everything happens in a line?
Well, I think you could certainly say that. I think there's a greater, less of a sense of trying to make sure that your words are the original words exactly the way you said it, as opposed to there's this common story. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cynthia.
I don't even know if it's relevant, but Judas in his despair and Saint Jude, is there any relationship?
No, Judas, well, except that they were both parts of the 12. There's Judas Iscariot, and then there was Jude Thaddeus, I think, is one of the other members of the 12.
Does Judas Iscariot have any, other than he betrayed Christ, what is his place in the history, theology-wise?
Well, I think there's certainly he was also the one that was supposedly the one who carried the purse. He was sort of the treasurer of the group, which may be a reminder for the church to pay attention to treasurers and make sure we have sound business practices. Does the fact that he was a treasurer mean that he was somewhat more concerned with the bottom line and practicality rather than some of the more heavenly things that Jesus was speaking of? We really don't know much about the 12, except that some were fishermen and some were, one had been, Matthew, of course, had been a tax collector according to tradition. But
yeah. Well, I mean, this is a major question for the early church, and particularly for Luke. And I think of Judas and Jesus Christ Superstar. He kind of raises the question for us. The sort of famous song from that is Jesus, It's All Gone Sour. What do we do with the fact that in experience, some people just can't accept Jesus? And I think Judas poses that question. He also poses the problem, what happens if part of God's elect falls, part of that elect 12, right? These 12 that sort of symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. Is it possible for someone that close to Jesus to fall away? I think that's the challenge that Judas kind of puts to us, sort of from the more figurative level. Mm-hmm. And for the early church, it'd be very important that someone would then take his place, right? And this is how you have the choosing of Matthias in Acts. So there are deep questions, very mysterious figure in a lot of ways, exactly what he means.
Question. I think it was Father Cover that made the comment about the makeup of the people who basically, when Pontius Pilate asked them, who do you want, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus Christ? And the makeup you indicated was mostly Jews, but I've gotten some knowledge about the possibility of it being primarily pagans, and then and Jewish pagan, and then also that some of the people were paid to be in the crowd. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's certainly possible. I don't think one can rule that out historically or not. There certainly would have been, because this was an international city, there would have been all kinds of people there in the crowd, and there certainly seems to be a reference in the Gospels that the people were stirred up by certain folks. So one of the other pieces, of course, is the whole sense we have of mob violence, where a peaceful protest or a group of onlookers all of a sudden can turn violent, as we saw last night in Ferguson, Missouri. So I think we have to pay attention to that.
I think you're right that getting to the history of what actually happened in the trial of Jesus is one of the questions that historians have kind of wrung their hands with quite a bit. And certainly if there's a crowd, that's a pretty ambiguous term. So who's in the crowd? Now it's clear though that there are, Jewish elders potentially involved here. And the way that the Matthew sets up the trial first happens in the Jewish court in the Sanhedrin, and then moves to the Roman court. And so I think there's trying to say, and this is another piece of the anti-Semitism discussion. I think we as Christians have to be clear that we don't want to whitewash the difficulties of the text. And this is what Brown says in his commentary, because the texts have been used to perpetrate violence against Jews. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to face up to what the text actually says, not to try to pretend it says something that it doesn't, but then to ask, what does that mean for us? And particularly, I think thinking about what it meant for Matthew's community might help us, give us a sense of historical distance from it, to then think about how we might apply it in our own day. So there's always that additional stage of, how do I apply a difficult text in the 21st century that has to be asked, I think. Thank you.
Yes, and Brown in his work, The Death of the Messiah, has a really, really good discussion of that whole concept, and I would commend it to all of you. And it helps outline some of the things that Matthew spoke of as we discussed this passage about taking responsibility in a way that was part of Jewish jurisprudence. The other piece I think that we need to be aware of whenever we talk about the Gospels is when we think of stories like this, because many of us students of history, we're looking for historical fact, and we're asking the question about, did it happen just that way? And what biblical scholars are speaking, and what we're looking for is historicity. I mean, is this true, and how was the author of the gospel telling the story in such a way to make the true point that Jesus Christ died on the cross, rose from the dead, and this is what it means for you? And I think a historian is simply going to first and foremost be mostly concerned with the actual factual things, then debating the facts, debate their historical significance, and try and understand why certain things happened. What the gospel authors are trying to do is to tell us what happened and what it means for us, not what it meant for them. And I think that's an important distinction for us to make, that the gospel looks forward and history books look backward.
Couldn't agree more.
Time for one last question.
They remark, what are you doing here? strikes me, because this is a question that I've asked myself. And it has to do with faith and belief and things like that. Now, the disturbing thing is, I guess for me, is, does faith mean that we have to believe absurd things about what a star is doing? Or can we be faithful and say, well, now there was a story about the what do you call them, the people that study stuff, astrologers, and there is a reason of a bunching of things that had to do with Jerusalem and the prophecy of a king and so forth. If faith means faithfulness, like here I am coming every day, waiting to find the truth, hoping to find it every day, then here I am. If faith is a gift, something that comes upon us and makes us say, well, it doesn't matter what stars can really do, this is the way it is. It doesn't matter what history or geology says, the earth is created 6,000 years ago, and that's that. My faith tells me this. This is a very disturbing thing for things like myself. Was there an earthquake? Surely there must be something that in the historical record that will tell us that it really happened. Or is the earthquake simply a story that makes whatever I want to sell you sound more true? And if the way we are saying that the scripture is, I can embellish this any way I want so that my point gets pounded into you, then this is extremely disturbing to me, because it says that maybe what I should think about is becoming, let's say, a Muslim, in which Christ is a respected figure, and but a prophet, a human being. And then we have a one God narrative, and it goes along a little more smoothly than what I like to call this lumpy trinity that we have to deal with. I wonder how you view these things.
Well, John, that would be a whole night for a whole course. But let me simply say this: I think the question of Jesus to Judas, friend, what are you doing here, is the question to each and every one of us. And I think that in the great Anglican way, I would answer your question, yes, in terms of is it this or is it that? Because I think it's both. And that doesn't say to me, what I understand is that faith is gift in terms of grace, but faith is a grace that respects us where we are, and so doesn't ask us to deny what's happening in history, but to go deeper. Which is to say, I don't think the biblical writers are trying to say to compel the truth in terms of fact, but to compel a truth that is beyond fact. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
If I can just respond to add on to what you've said here. I think it's very important that Christianity is a historical religion. I think as soon as we reduce the details of the passion of the Jesus story simply to a theological expression of my own personal faith experience, we've gone down the road of Bultmann's demythologization. And I'm not comfortable with that. I think there is a real historical kernel here. Something happened. And it's not just a happening in my faith or the faith of the early community. And this is why I think the study of the historical Jesus, although it is backwards looking, is quite important. Because there are reasons to rationally think that Jesus existed, that he said certain things. Even the name Jesus, people say, well, his name couldn't have been Jesus, it was Yeshua, because we know it was a Hebrew Aramaic name, but in the Galilean dialect of Aramaic, they often drop the last syllable, so Yeshu was very probably his name. So in other words, we actually do know quite a bit about the historical Jesus. Now, whether each detail of the infancy narratives, in a certain way, it can't be the case, right? Because they contradict each other in terms of some details. So, is there theological embellishment? Of course. Is there therefore no historical core? I think that would be an unfounded conclusion. And so, I don't think that we have to jettison reason. And in a way, what you're posing is the question of sort of science and faith. And so a kind of question to pose back to you would be, if we could prove that there was an earthquake, would it necessarily compel faith? If we could prove that Jesus' body wasn't in the tomb, would that necessarily compel faith? I think these are not absurd things. It's not absurd to believe that a certain natural event could have accompanied something that happened in the life of Jesus, but it certainly wouldn't prove who he was. You could still say it was a coincidence. You could still say they moved his body.
Yes.
But thank you for that. It's a very deep and trenchant question. And I think that is the scandal and the problem of Christianity in a lot of ways, is it insists on this God who's not neat and tidy. But that's what the centurion, I guess, saw on the cross. So, and that's like the question we do. And again, it is Matthew's story is dark. Friend, why are you here? Is already the moment of judgment, and it's too late.
Yeah.
So,
and I would conclude by saying the Trinity is lumpy, but life is lumpy, and if we're made in the image of God, then the lumpiness is a part of who we are, beginning from the clay of the earth from which we were formed. So thank you, John. And thank you, everybody, for a good night. Thank you, Mr. Dean. We're a little past 8 o'clock. We will see you next week. And Mr. Dean, anything else that you need to say?
No, I was just going to throw in my father, great Irish storyteller. One of his corollaries was never let the facts get in the way of the truth. That you can spin facts, but the truth is absolute. And so we can crunch on that. Well, thank you for joining us again this week. Next week, we'll be here at 7 o'clock, and our guest scholar will be Christopher Wells, the editor of the Living Church, and we'll be looking at the Gospel of Luke. So until next week, good night.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
That was fun.
Matthew, that was great fun. That was great fun.